Jake Morrison pressed his face against the small window of the ESV Liberty as the massive council station came into view. The structure was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Crystal spires twisted upward like frozen lightning, each one glowing with a cold blue light that made his skin feel uncomfortable even through the ship's hull. The entire station orbited around a cluster of dying stars, their red glow mixing with the blue crystal light to create an eerie purple haze that filled the surrounding space. First time seeing the council station, "Captain," said Lieutenant Amy Parker from behind him. She was the only other human on the diplomatic mission, chosen because she could speak 7 different alien languages fluently. Pretty impressive, isn't it? Jake nodded but said nothing. Impressive was one word for it. Intimidating was another. The station was easily 50 times larger than Earth's biggest space city, and it had been here for over 3,000 years. Every piece of it had been built by the Zephyrians, the reptilian race that had controlled the galaxy for longer than human civilization had existed. The communications panel crackled to life, and a cold voice spoke in perfect English. "Human vessel ESV Liberty, you are cleared to dock at Port 17. You will proceed directly to Processing Center Alpha for species verification and biological scanning. Any deviation from the designated path will result in immediate detention." Amy translated the message back into the ship's computer, though Jake had understood every word. The Zephyrians made sure all lesser species learned their language, but they rarely bothered to learn anyone else's. It was just another way of showing who was really in charge. The docking process took 3 hours. Jake had expected it to take maybe 30 minutes, but the Zephyrians seemed to enjoy making other species wait. Every document was checked multiple times. Every piece of equipment was scanned and rescanned. The biological scanning process was particularly unpleasant, involving probes and sensors that mapped every detail of their DNA. "Purpose of visit?" demanded the Zephyrian official at the processing center. The creature was nearly 8 feet tall, with dark green scales and yellow eyes that never seemed to blink. Its voice came out as a low hiss that made Jake's teeth ache. "Diplomatic mission representing Earth and the human species," Jake replied, keeping his voice steady. "We're here for the quarterly council session as probationary members." The Zephyrian's mouth opened slightly, revealing rows of sharp teeth in what might have been amusement. Probationary members, yes, the mammals from the small blue world. How quaint. Jake felt his jaw tighten but forced himself to remain calm. Humans had only been granted probationary membership in the Galactic Council 6 months ago, after a fleet of human ships had successfully defended a mining colony from Zephyrian pirates. The pirates hadn't expected the humans to fight back with such creativity and determination. Most species simply paid the protection fees and hoped for the best, but humans were different. When the pirates had demanded tribute from the mining colony, the human defenders had used the asteroids themselves as weapons, launching them at high speed toward the pirate ships while using the colony's mining lasers to create devastating crossfires. The pirates had retreated, but not before losing half their fleet to tactics they had never encountered before. The incident had forced the Zephyrian High Command to acknowledge that humans might be more than just another weak mammalian species. Probationary membership was the result, though Jake suspected it was more about keeping humans under observation than actually including them in galactic politics. "You will be assigned quarters in Section C-17, the official continued, scanning a data pad with one clawed finger. "Council sessions begin tomorrow at the 3rd sunrise. Your seating assignment is position 847 in the observer gallery." Amy leaned forward. "Excuse me, but we were told that probationary members would have actual seats in the council chamber." The Zephyrian's yellow eyes fixed on her with what was definitely amusement now. "You do have a seat in the council chamber. Position 847 in the observer gallery, where all the lesser mammals sit." Jake felt heat rising in his cheeks but kept his expression neutral. "I understand. Thank you for the accommodation." Their quarters turned out to be a single small room with 2 narrow beds and a tiny bathroom. The temperature was kept deliberately cool, perfect for reptilian comfort but uncomfortably cold for mammals. The walls were bare metal and the only window looked out at the station's waste processing section. "This is insulting," Amy said once they were alone. "They're treating us like pets." "That's exactly how they're treating us," Jake replied, sitting on one of the uncomfortable beds. "The question is what we do about it." He pulled out a small datapad and began reviewing the files he had studied during the journey. The Zephyrian Empire controlled nearly 60% of the galaxy's inhabited systems. Their technology was centuries ahead of humanity's. Their military was vast and experienced, and their political system had been stable for thousands of years. By any reasonable measure, they had every right to look down on newer species. But Jake had noticed something during his research. The Zephyrian Empire hadn't faced a real challenge in over 500 years. Every species they had encountered had eventually been absorbed, defeated, or relegated to minor status. They had grown comfortable with their superiority, perhaps even lazy about it. The next morning, Jake and Amy made their way to the council chamber. The corridors of the station were filled with representatives from dozens of different species, but Jake noticed that nearly all of them were reptilian. The few mammals he saw moved quickly and kept their heads down, clearly trying not to attract attention. The council chamber itself was breathtaking. The ceiling rose hundreds of feet overhead, supported by massive crystal pillars that hummed with energy. The central floor was arranged in concentric circles, with the most important seats closest to the center. The Zephyrian High Chancellor's throne sat at the very middle, elevated above all the other positions. Position 847 was exactly where Jake had expected it to be. High up in the gallery, squeezed between a representative from a species that looked like walking mushrooms and another that resembled oversized rats. The seat itself was clearly designed for reptilian comfort, with a hard surface and no padding whatsoever. "Welcome to the pest section," whispered the rat-like creature next to him in broken English. "This is where they put all the mammals who think they matter." Jake looked around the observer gallery and realized that every single occupant was indeed a warm-blooded species. Meanwhile, the main floor was filled entirely with various types of reptilians, all sitting in comfortable padded seats with personal climate controls and communication systems. High Chancellor Vexithara the Cold-Minded entered the chamber with a procession of advisors and guards. The creature was ancient even by Zephyrian standards, with silver-tinted scales and eyes like chips of ice. When Vexithara spoke, the entire chamber fell silent. "The Council recognizes the presence of several new probationary members," the High Chancellor announced, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics, including the mammals from the system they call Sul. How amusing to see such primitive creatures attempt to participate in civilized governance. Laughter rippled through the main floor, a sound like breaking glass. Jake felt every eye in the observer gallery turn toward him, some sympathetic, others merely curious. He stood up slowly, knowing that protocol demanded he acknowledge the recognition. "Humanity is honored to participate in the Council's proceedings," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "We look forward to contributing to galactic peace and prosperity." Vexthara's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "Indeed. Though I suspect your contributions will be quite different from what you imagine." Jake sat back down, his mind already working. The High Chancellor was right about one thing. His contributions would be very different from what anyone in this chamber imagined. 3 months had passed since Jake Morrison first sat in position 847, and the routine had become painfully familiar. Every morning he would make his way through the cold corridors to the council chamber, take his uncomfortable seat in the observer gallery, and watch the Zephyrians make decisions that affected billions of lives across the galaxy. Every proposal he submitted was either ignored completely or dismissed with barely concealed amusement. The worst part was not the dismissal itself, but how public it had become. High Chancellor Vexithara had taken to using Jake as a regular source of entertainment during the Council's broadcast sessions. These sessions were viewed by millions of beings across hundreds of worlds, and Jake had become something of a galactic joke. "The human representative has submitted another proposal," Vexithara announced during one particularly humiliating session, holding up Jake's carefully prepared document with 2 clawed fingers as if it were contaminated. This time, the mammals suggest a mutual defense pact between Earth and the Centauri colonies. How delightfully naive. The Reptilian Council members hissed with laughter, a sound that always made Jake's skin crawl. Vexthara continued his performance with obvious relish. "Perhaps the humans do not understand that defense pacts require actual defensive capabilities. What exactly would Earth contribute to such an arrangement? Primitive chemical rockets, outdated kinetic weapons, the enthusiasm of children playing at war." More laughter filled the chamber. Jake remained seated, his face carefully neutral, but inside he was taking notes. Every insult, every dismissal, every assumption the Zephyrians made about human capabilities was being catalogued and remembered. After the session ended, Jake made his way to a small cafe in one of the station's lower levels. The establishment catered to the non-reptilian population, which meant it was always nearly empty, and the few customers spoke in hushed voices. It had become his regular meeting place with others who, like him, occupied the political margins of galactic society. Tony Hayes was already waiting at their usual table. The man represented the Canid Confederation, a group of worlds populated by beings that resembled large, intelligent wolves. Tony was unusual among the mammalian representatives because he had been at the station for nearly 5 years and had developed a network of contacts throughout the non-reptilian community. "Rough session today," Tony said as Jake sat down. Vexithera seemed particularly pleased with himself. "He always is," Jake replied, ordering coffee from the automated service system. "But I noticed something interesting. Did you see how quickly he dismissed the mutual defense proposal? He didn't even pretend to consider it. That's not unusual. The Zephyrians dismiss everything we propose. No, this was different. He was almost nervous about it. Like the idea of mammalian species forming military alliances actually worried him." Tony leaned back in his chair, his wolf-like features thoughtful. "You might be onto something. The Zephyrians have spent centuries making sure non-reptilian species stay isolated from each other. They control the trade routes, the communication networks, even the diplomatic protocols. Everything is designed to prevent us from coordinating." Jake nodded. It was something he had been thinking about for weeks. The galactic political system seemed specifically designed to keep mammalian species competing with each other rather than cooperating. Trade agreements were structured to create conflicts over resources. Communication between non-reptilian worlds was expensive and heavily monitored. Even the seating arrangements in the council chamber were designed to prevent easy interaction between mammalian representatives. "What do you know about Zephyrian military doctrine?" Jake asked quietly. Tony glanced around the cafe to make sure no one was listening, then leaned forward. "More than they think I do. The Canids have been studying their tactics for decades. Why do you ask?" "Because I think they're vulnerable in ways they don't realize. Every military engagement I've read about follows the same pattern. Overwhelming force applied methodically until the enemy surrenders. They're incredibly good at it, but they've been doing the same thing for centuries." "It works," Tony pointed out. "They haven't lost a major conflict in over 500 years. Against other reptilian species," Jake said. "But when was the last time they fought mammals? Really fought them, not just suppressed colonial uprisings or dealt with pirates?" Tony thought for a moment. "I don't think they ever have. Not seriously, anyway. By the time they encounter a new mammalian species, they're already so technologically superior that resistance is pointless." Jake pulled out his datapad and showed Tony a series of files he had been compiling. "Look at this. Zephyrian battle formations, tactical protocols, strategic planning methods. It's all based on fighting enemies who think like they do. Patient, methodical, predictable. What are you getting at? Mammals don't think like reptiles. We're adaptable, creative, willing to take risks. What they call impulsiveness, we call tactical flexibility. What they see as emotional decision-making, we know as the ability to change strategies quickly when circumstances change." Tony's eyes widened as he began to understand what Jake was suggesting. "You're talking about actually challenging them, militarily." "Not yet," Jake said quickly. "But I think we need to start preparing for the possibility. And the first step is building the kind of alliances they're so nervous about." Over the following weeks, Jake began reaching out to other mammalian representatives in ways that wouldn't attract Zephyrian attention. He started with casual conversations in the corridors, brief exchanges in the observer gallery, shared meals in the lower-level cafes. Gradually, he built a network of contacts among species that had been isolated from each other for decades. The breakthrough came when he met Lisa Chen, the representative from the ferret worlds. The ferret people were small, quick-thinking mammals who had developed remarkable manufacturing capabilities despite Zephyrian trade restrictions. Lisa had been trying for years to establish trade agreements with other mammalian worlds, but the Zephyrian bureaucracy had blocked every attempt. "They don't want us sharing technology," Lisa explained during one of their secret meetings. "My people have developed modular construction techniques that could revolutionize space habitat construction. The Canids have sensor technology that's actually superior to some Zephyrian systems. The Ursine Collective has material science that would make their starship armor look like paper, but none of us are allowed to trade freely with each other. Jake felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. What if we found ways to share information without going through official channels? What if we started coordinating our council proposals so they support each other instead of competing? The Zephyrians would notice eventually, Tony warned. Let them notice, Jake said. In fact, I want them to notice. I want them to see mammalian species working together for the first time in centuries. I want them to start wondering what else we might be capable of when we stop fighting each other and start cooperating. The plan they developed was simple, but effective. Each mammalian representative would continue submitting proposals as usual, but now the proposals would be coordinated to create a web of mutual support. Trade agreements, research partnerships, cultural exchanges, even tourism arrangements would all be structured to strengthen bonds between mammalian worlds. The Zephyrians began to notice the pattern within weeks. Jake could see Vexithera's irritation growing as proposal after proposal seemed designed to increase mammalian cooperation. The High Chancellor's dismissals became harsher, his mockery more pointed. The mammals seemed to have developed delusions of significance, Vexithera announced during one particularly tense session. They submit these pathetic attempts at alliance building as if they were meaningful, political entities rather than primitive creatures playing at civilization. But Jake noticed something else in the High Chancellor's voice, something that might have been uncertainty. For the first time in centuries, the Zephyrians were seeing behavior they didn't fully understand. Mammalian species were cooperating instead of competing. They were building relationships instead of fighting over scraps. And that, Jake realized, was exactly what he had been hoping for. The challenge came on a Tuesday morning during what should have been a routine council session. Jake had submitted another proposal for interspecies cooperation, this time suggesting a joint research initiative between human scientists and Canid engineers. He expected the usual dismissive laughter and condescending remarks from High Chancellor Vexithera. Instead, the ancient reptilian leader stood slowly from his throne and fixed his icy gaze directly on Jake's position in the observer gallery. The entire chamber fell silent, thousands of representatives holding their breath as they sensed something different in the air. Human Morrison. Vexithera's voice carried clearly through the chamber, each word precisely pronounced. Your persistent attempts to elevate mammalian significance have become tiresome. Perhaps it is time to demonstrate conclusively why reptilian leadership has guided this galaxy for 3 millennia, while mammals remained in caves. Jake felt his heart begin to race, but he stood calmly and waited for the High Chancellor to continue. Around him, the other mammalian representatives shifted nervously in their uncomfortable seats. I invoke the ancient right of trial by minds, Vexithera declared. Let the human prove his species worthy of even probationary status, or let him and his kind accept permanent relegation to observer status only. A gasp went through the chamber. The trial by minds was an old Zephyrian tradition that had not been invoked in over 200 years. It was considered the ultimate test of intellectual and strategic superiority, traditionally used to settle disputes between Zephyrian noble houses. No non-reptilian species had ever been granted the right to participate. Jake knew this was the moment he had been preparing for, even though he had not expected it to come so soon. I accept the challenge on behalf of humanity and all mammalian species, he said clearly. Vexithera's mouth curved into what might have been a smile. Excellent. The trial will consist of 3 phases conducted over the next 7 days. Strategic games, technological demonstration, and tactical simulation. The entire galaxy will witness the superiority of reptilian intelligence over mammalian impulse. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Jake was moved to special quarters designed for trial participants, given access to advanced computer systems, and provided with detailed rules for each phase of the competition. Amy worked frantically to establish secure communication links with Earth, while Tony and the other mammalian representatives began coordinating support from their homeworlds. The first phase began the following morning in a specialized arena within the council station. The strategic games were traditional Zephyrian contests that tested long-term planning, resource management, and patience. Jake found himself seated across from Vexithera at a table equipped with holographic displays showing complex star maps and resource flows. The first game was called Deep Current, a simulation of managing trade routes and resource allocation across multiple star systems over a 50-year period. Jake watched as Vexithera began setting up elaborate supply chains and defensive positions, each move calculated to provide maximum efficiency and security. Jake took a different approach. Instead of trying to optimize every detail, he focused on creating flexible systems that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. When Vexithera established a major trading hub in one system, Jake created smaller, mobile trading posts that could shift locations based on market demands. When the High Chancellor built massive defensive installations, Jake developed rapid response fleets that could be anywhere in his territory within days. The Zephyrian approach was undoubtedly more efficient in the short term, but Jake's flexible systems proved more resilient when the game introduced random events like natural disasters, technological breakthroughs, and political upheavals. While Vexithera's carefully planned network struggled to adapt, Jake's modular approach allowed him to turn disruptions into opportunities. By the end of the first game, Jake had achieved a marginal victory. The audience of reptilian observers seemed puzzled rather than impressed. They had expected the human to be completely outmatched by Zephyrian strategic thinking. The second game, Stellar Conquest, was more directly military in nature. Players had to expand their territories while defending against enemies and managing limited resources. Vexithera immediately began constructing massive fleets in fortified positions, following classical reptilian doctrine of overwhelming force and impregnable defense. Jake studied the game board for several minutes before making his first moves. Instead of building large fleets, he created small, fast ships that could strike quickly and disappear before enemy forces could respond. Rather than fortifying systems, he established hidden bases in asteroid fields and nebulae. When Vexithera's massive fleets moved to attack, they found empty space where Jake's forces had been moments before. The key moment came when Vexithera committed his main fleet to what appeared to be a decisive battle. Jake's forces seemed trapped and outnumbered, facing inevitable destruction. But instead of fighting, Jake triggered a tactical retreat that drew the Zephyrian fleet deep into a carefully prepared trap. Hidden mining charges turned the battlefield into a maze of debris, while Jake's fast ships used the chaos to launch devastating hit-and-run attacks. By the time Vexithera realized what had happened, his superior fleet had been divided and defeated in detail by an enemy that refused to fight according to established rules. Jake had won the second game decisively, and murmurs of amazement began to spread through the reptilian audience. The technological demonstration phase took place in the station's main engineering bay. Each participant was required to design and build a solution to a practical problem using available materials and fabrication equipment. The challenge was to create a defense system capable of protecting a space station from multiple attack vectors simultaneously. Vexithera's solution was elegant and powerful. He designed a series of massive energy shields supported by long-range weapon platforms that could destroy incoming threats at great distances. The system was incredibly sophisticated, using advanced Zephyrian technology to create an almost impenetrable defensive network. Jake's approach was radically different. Instead of creating one powerful defense system, he built dozens of smaller independent units that worked together. Each unit was relatively simple and cheap to produce, but they communicated with each other through an adaptive network that could respond to threats in real time. When the test began, Vexithera's system performed flawlessly against conventional attacks. The energy shields absorbed massive amounts of damage, while the weapon platforms systematically destroyed incoming threats. But Jake's distributed defense system began to show its true nature when the simulation introduced unconventional attack patterns, swarm attacks that overwhelmed. Single points were handled by dynamic load balancing across Jake's entire network. Stealth attacks that bypassed the main defenses were detected by multiple overlapping sensor grids. Electronic warfare attacks that disabled individual components were compensated for by redundant systems that adapted automatically. Most impressively, when several of Jake's defense units were destroyed, the remaining units immediately reconfigured themselves to cover the gaps. The system actually became more efficient as it learned from each attack, adapting its responses faster than the simulated enemies could change their tactics. By the end of the demonstration, Jake's system was successfully defending against attack patterns that had completely overwhelmed Vexithera's more powerful, but less flexible design. The reptilian audience sat in stunned silence as the results were announced. Jake had won 2 phases out of 3, with only the tactical simulation remaining. For the first time in centuries, a non-reptilian intelligence had outperformed Zephyrian strategic thinking in direct competition. The implications were staggering, and Jake could see fear beginning to replace arrogance in the eyes of the council members. Vexithara stood slowly, his ancient features showing strain for the first time. "The final phase will determine everything," he declared. "Tomorrow we test not theory but practical military command. May the superior mind prevail." Jake nodded respectfully, but inside he was already planning his next moves. The tactical simulation would involve commanding actual starship fleets in live exercises. It was time to show the galaxy what mammalian warfare really looked like when it was no longer hiding in the shadows. The tactical simulation arena was unlike anything Jake had ever seen before. Massive holographic displays surrounded 2 command chairs positioned at opposite ends of a circular platform. Each display showed real-time data from actual starship fleets positioned in empty space near the council station. This would not be a computer simulation but a live military exercise using genuine vessels and crews. Jake settled into his command chair and studied the tactical displays. He had been given command of a mixed fleet representing various mammalian species, 12 human vessels from Earth's defense fleet, 8 cannoned warships with their advanced sensor arrays, 6 fast ferret corsairs, and a handful of ships from other mammalian worlds. In total, he controlled 37 vessels of different designs and capabilities. Across the arena, High Chancellor Vexithera commanded 50 Zephyrian warships of the latest design. Each vessel was larger and more heavily armed than anything in Jake's fleet. The Zephyrian ships moved in perfect formation, their crews trained in tactics that had dominated the galaxy for centuries. The exercise boundaries covered a volume of space containing 3 asteroid fields, 2 gas giant systems, and multiple debris clouds from ancient battles. Jake realized immediately that the terrain would be crucial to his strategy. Open space favored the Zephyrians with their superior firepower and armor. Complex terrain would allow his smaller, more maneuverable ships to use their advantages. "Begin tactical simulation," announced the arena's control system. Vexithera's fleet immediately formed into a classic Zephyrian battle formation. The largest ships created a defensive core, while medium cruisers formed screening lines and fast scouts moved ahead to gather intelligence. It was textbook reptilian doctrine, executed with mechanical precision. Jake took a different approach entirely. Instead of forming a single fleet, he divided his forces into 7 independent groups. Each group contained ships with complementary capabilities and was assigned to a different region of the battle space. The human vessels spread out through the asteroid fields. The cannoned ships positioned themselves near the gas giants where their sensors would be most effective, and the fast ferret corsairs began prowling the outer edges of the engagement zone. "What is the human doing?" Jake heard one of the reptilian observers ask. "His forces are scattered and vulnerable to defeat in detail." Vexithara clearly shared this assessment. The Zephyrian fleet moved confidently toward the largest concentration of Jake's ships, intending to destroy them with overwhelming firepower before the scattered mammalian forces could coordinate a response. But Jake was not planning to fight a conventional battle. As the Zephyrian fleet approached the asteroid field where his human ships were positioned, those vessels suddenly dispersed in all directions. Instead of standing and fighting, they used the asteroids as cover while launching hit-and-run attacks on the edges of the Zephyrian formation. The Zephyrian fleet found itself trying to fight enemies that would not stay still long enough to be targeted effectively. Every time they moved to engage one group of human ships, those vessels would disappear deeper into the asteroid field, while attacks came from completely different directions. Meanwhile, the cannoned vessels near the gas giants were using their superior sensors to map every movement of the Zephyrian fleet. This information was being shared in real time with all of Jake's scattered forces, giving them perfect intelligence about enemy positions and intentions. Vexithara adapted by dividing his own fleet into smaller groups to pursue the scattered mammalian forces. This was exactly what Jake had been hoping for. The moment the Zephyrian fleet broke formation, The ferret corsairs struck from the outer edges of the battle space. The fast ferret ships had been invisible to Zephyrian sensors while hiding in the debris clouds. Now they launched coordinated attacks against the divided Zephyrian forces, striking hard and fast before disappearing back into concealment. Each attack was perfectly timed to hit Zephyrian ships when they were isolated and unable to support each other. The turning point came when Vexithara committed his reserves to what appeared to be a decisive engagement. A large group of Zephyrian ships cornered several human vessels in a narrow canyon between two large asteroids. Victory seemed certain as the reptilian warships moved in for the kill, but the human ships were not trapped. They had been deliberately positioned as bait. As the Zephyrian forces entered the asteroid canyon, hidden charges that had been placed by earlier mammalian raids detonated throughout the rocky walls. The carefully planned trap turned the canyon into a death trap, with massive chunks of rock colliding with Zephyrian ships, while Jake's vessels used emergency thrusters to escape through predetermined routes. In the confusion that followed, coordinated attacks struck the Zephyrian fleet from every direction at once. Human ships emerged from hidden positions in the asteroids. Cannid vessels used the gas giant's gravity wells to accelerate to incredible speeds, and ferret corsairs appeared seemingly from nowhere to strike at command vessels and support ships. The Zephyrian fleet, designed to fight enemies that would meet them in honorable battle, found itself facing an enemy that fought like a pack of predators. Every time they tried to establish a defensive position, attacks came from unexpected angles. Every time they moved to pursue one group of attackers, they exposed themselves to strikes from other directions. Vexthara's tactical displays showed his fleet being systematically dismantled by forces that should have been inferior in every measurable way. His ships were individually superior, his crews were more experienced, and his technology was more advanced, but none of that mattered when the enemy refused to fight according to established rules. "This is not warfare," Vexithara declared, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's communication system. "This is chaos and disorder." "This is adaptation," Jake replied calmly. "This is what happens when you face an enemy that thinks differently than you do." The final phase of the battle demonstrated the true difference between reptilian and mammalian approaches to conflict. Vexithara attempted to rally his remaining ships for a coordinated counterattack, but Jake had anticipated this. Instead of allowing the Zephyrian fleet to regroup, his scattered forces launched what appeared to be a suicidal assault on the reptilian command ship. The attack looked like desperation, with damaged mammalian vessels throwing themselves at heavily defended Zephyrian positions. Reptilian observers assumed they were witnessing the final futile gesture of a defeated enemy. But Jake understood something that Vexithara did not. Sometimes the willingness to accept heavy losses in pursuit of a strategic objective was itself a weapon. Seemingly desperate attacks were actually precisely coordinated strikes designed to create specific weaknesses in the Zephyrian defensive formation. Each mammalian ship that was destroyed or damaged had completed its assigned mission of forcing the enemy fleet into a particular position. When the trap was finally sprung, the remaining Zephyrian vessels found themselves surrounded and outmaneuvered by forces they had thought were already defeated. The simulation ended with Vexthara's command ship surrendering after the complete destruction of his fleet. Jake's forces had taken heavy casualties, but they had achieved total victory through tactics that no reptilian commander had ever encountered. The arena fell completely silent as the tactical displays went dark. Across the galaxy, billions of beings had witnessed the impossible. A mammalian fleet had defeated Zephyrian military doctrine through nothing more than creative thinking and adaptive tactics. Jake stood slowly from his command chair and looked across the arena at Vexithara. The ancient High Chancellor remained seated, staring at his dark displays with an expression of shock and disbelief. For the first time in over 3,000 years, reptilian military supremacy had been challenged and found wanting. The galaxy would never be the same. The silence in the council chamber stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Jake remained standing beside his command chair while Vexithara sat motionless, staring at the dark tactical displays that had just shown the complete defeat of his fleet. Around them, thousands of representatives from across the galaxy watched in stunned amazement as the implications of what they had witnessed began to sink in. Finally, Vexithera rose slowly from his chair. The ancient High Chancellor moved like someone who had aged decades in the span of a few hours. His scales, which had always gleamed with health and authority, now seemed dull and brittle. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual commanding power. "The trial by minds is concluded," he announced to the chamber. "The human Morrison has achieved victory in all 3 phases of competition." A murmur ran through the assembled representatives, growing louder as the reality of the situation became clear. For the first time in recorded galactic history, a non-reptilian species had demonstrated intellectual and tactical superiority over Zephyrian leadership. Jake walked across the arena platform to where Vexithara stood. The 2 beings faced each other, mammal and reptile, representing entirely different approaches to existence and governance. Jake could see something in the High Chancellor's ancient eyes that might have been respect, or perhaps simply exhaustion. "According to the ancient laws governing the trial by minds," Vexithera continued, his words carrying to every corner of the chamber, "the victor has the right to claim any reasonable reward within the power of the defeated to grant." "What do you demand, human Morrison?" This was the moment Jake had been preparing for since the challenge was first issued. He had won more than just a competition. He had shattered assumptions that had governed galactic politics for millennia. The question now was what to do with that victory. Jake looked around the chamber, his gaze taking in the reptilian representatives in their comfortable seats on the main floor, and then moving up to the observer gallery where dozens of mammalian species sat in their cramped, uncomfortable positions. The symbolism was perfect for what he was about to propose. "I claim the right to restructure the Galactic Council," Jake said clearly. "No more observer galleries, no more special seats for supposedly superior species. Every world with intelligent life gets equal representation and equal voice in galactic governance." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Reptilian representatives leaped to their feet, hissing and shouting in outrage. The idea of sharing power with mammalian species was so foreign to their thinking that many seemed unable to process the concept. "Impossible," shouted one of Vexithera's advisors. "The mammals lack the wisdom and patience necessary for proper governance. They are guided by emotion and impulse rather than logic and reason." "Today's demonstration suggests otherwise," Jake replied calmly. "Emotion and impulse, as you call them, allowed mammalian tactics to defeat reptilian logic decisively. Perhaps what you see as weaknesses are actually different kinds of strengths." Vexithera raised one clawed hand, and the chamber gradually fell silent. The High Chancellor studied Jake with those ancient eyes, clearly weighing options that all seemed equally unpalatable. "Your demand would require abandoning governmental structures that have maintained galactic stability for 3,000 years, he said finally. "Your structures have maintained reptilian dominance for 3,000 years, Jake corrected. "Stability for some is not the same as justice for all." The debate that followed lasted for hours. Reptilian representatives argued that mammalian species lacked the experience and temperament for galactic leadership. They pointed to humanity's short existence as a spacefaring species, to the conflicts and chaos that seemed to follow mammalian expansion, to the rapid changes in mammalian societies that showed their inherent instability. But Jake had allies now, and they were no longer willing to remain silent. Tony Hayes rose from his position in the observer gallery and addressed the chamber with a dignity that commanded attention. "The Canid Confederation has existed as a stable interstellar government for over 800 years, he declared. "We have never initiated aggressive war against our neighbors, never enslaved other species, and never claimed superiority based on the accident of our birth. Perhaps experience is not measured only in years, but in how wisely those years are used." Lisa Chen from the Ferret Worlds spoke next, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "My people have developed technologies that could benefit every species in this galaxy, but Zephyrian trade restrictions have prevented us from sharing our innovations. How many advances have been lost because reptilian pride refused to learn from mammalian creativity?" One by one, representatives from mammalian species that had been silent for centuries began to speak. They talked about innovations suppressed, alliances forbidden, and potential unrealized because the galactic system had been designed to keep them divided and powerless. The chamber heard stories of discrimination, exploitation, and casual cruelty that had been hidden beneath the surface of reptilian civilization. As the testimonies continued, Jake watched Vexithera's expression carefully. The High Chancellor was clearly struggling with concepts that challenged every assumption about reptilian superiority that had guided his long life. But Jake could also see intelligence in those ancient eyes. And intelligence meant the ability to recognize when old ideas no longer served their purpose. The turning point came when one of the reptilian representatives made a crucial mistake. In his anger at the proposed changes, he declared that mammalian species should be grateful for Zephyrian protection and guidance rather than demanding equality with their betters. Protection from what? Jake asked quietly. From threats that you created? From conflicts that you started? From problems that exist because your system treats most of the galaxy's population as second-class citizens? Vexthara stood slowly, and the chamber fell silent once again. The High Chancellor looked around at his fellow reptilians, then up at the mammalian representatives in the observer gallery, and finally back at Jake. The trial by minds was designed to test intellectual superiority, he said finally. You have demonstrated that mammalian thinking offers capabilities that reptilian logic alone cannot provide. Perhaps it is time to discover what we might accomplish by combining our different strengths rather than using them to dominate each other. The formal restructuring of the Galactic Council took several months to complete. New seating arrangements were installed that placed all representatives at equal levels. Voting procedures were revised to give every species proportional representation based on population rather than assumed superiority. Trade restrictions were lifted, allowing free exchange of ideas and innovations between all member worlds. Jake found himself elected as the first non-reptilian council chairman in galactic history. The irony was not lost on him that he now occupied the central position that had once been reserved for High Chancellor, Vexthara alone. But the real change was not in the seating arrangements or the voting procedures. It was in the conversations happening throughout the galaxy, as species that had been kept apart for centuries began to discover what they could accomplish together. Canid sensors combined with human adaptability and ferret manufacturing created defensive systems that surpassed anything the Zephyrians had ever built. Collaborative research projects produced scientific advances that no single species could have achieved alone. The galaxy began to buzz with activity as mammalian creativity was finally unleashed. Trade routes that had been stagnant for centuries suddenly became bustling corridors of commerce and cultural exchange. Conflicts that had simmered for decades were resolved through negotiation and compromise, rather than Zephyrian enforcement. Not all reptilian species accepted the changes gracefully, but they found themselves increasingly isolated as the benefits of cooperation became obvious to everyone else. Even within Zephyrian space, younger generations began to question whether their ancestors' assumptions about mammalian inferiority had been correct. One evening, as Jake worked late in his new office reviewing proposals from dozens of worlds, he was surprised by a visit from Vexthara. The former High Chancellor looked older but somehow more at peace than Jake had ever seen him. "I wanted to thank you," the old reptile said simply. "For defeating you publicly," Jake asked with genuine curiosity. "For showing me that strength comes in many forms," Vexthara replied. "For 3,000 years we believed that our way was the only way. We became so focused on maintaining our position that we forgot to ask whether that position was worth maintaining." Jake gestured to a chair, and the two former opponents sat together in comfortable silence for a moment. "There is room for reptilian wisdom in this new galaxy," Jake said finally. "Your patience and long-term thinking are valuable qualities that complement mammalian adaptability. The question is whether you are willing to share the table rather than dominate it." Vexthara's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. "I think I am beginning to understand that a shared table offers more interesting conversations than a lonely throne." Outside the office windows, the council station bustled with activity, as representatives from hundreds of worlds worked together on projects that would have been EUI